Welcome to Broad Street to Brideshead. Today I'm joined by celebrated author Amitav Ghosh, author of the Ibis trilogy, The Hungry Tide, Sea of Poppies, The Nutmeg's Curse and Gun Island, to name just a few. His novels intricately weave together themes of colonialism, identity, migration, the environment and myth. His stories interconnect individual characters with the major global historical events going on in their lives. He dissolves boundaries between fiction, non-fiction, history and anthropology, creating profound, complex works, which leave a mark on the reader long after they've closed the back cover. Amitav Ghosh, thank you so much for joining me today. I would like to start by just have you talk to me a little bit about your journey to Oxford and why you decided social anthropology, because that sounds like a really interesting subject, but also not one that you sort of immediately think of. And then also whether you knew that writing was always going to be what you wanted to do, or whether that was something that came out of your studies.
Well, those are some very big questions. I'll try and answer them as best I can. It was a sort of strange journey that got me to Oxford, really. I had done my undergraduate studies at Delhi University. And after that, I didn't really want to go on with, with studying and academics and so on. So I went into journalism. I worked for a paper called the Indian Express, which was in New Delhi. But a friend of mine persuaded me to sign up for an MA in what was essentially social anthropology at Delhi University. So I was doing two things at the same time. I was studying anthropology, and I was working at the Indian Express. But the two actually, they sort of fed into each other, because a lot of the journalistic work I did really consisted of something that was like anthropological fieldwork, going and reporting from various places. So there was a kind of similarity between them. And it so happened that a couple of years before I graduated with my MA, this Indian family started up this set of scholarships. The family was the Shivdasani family, and their scholarships are called the INLACS scholarships. At that time, they paid for 2 years at either Oxford or Cambridge. It had just started up, but it was already very, very competitive, and it was very difficult to get. But, a friend of mine who'd got it the year before persuaded me to apply. And you asked about writing. Well, back then in India, there was really no such thing as a writing career, especially if you were writing in English. So that was why I always wanted to be a writer, But for me, I wanted to have the experience of the world that would make it possible for me to be a writer. And for me, that meant travel, because, many of the writers I really admired, like James Baldwin and V.S. Naipaul and so on, they were great travelers, So there's a kind of, there's a way in which travel and writing sort of inform each other, So I wanted to travel, really. So that was why I put in an application for this scholarship. And that year, they were giving the scholarship to just 8 applicants. And so I went for the interview, and I don't remember what I said or anything. But then the list of successful applicants came out, and I was 10th on the list. So really, it was just awful, because I thought, oh my God, now what do I do? But then, fortunately, 2 of the people who were ahead of me dropped out and went off to American universities. So I just squeaked in, and I got this scholarship. And it was really completely a life-changing experience. Suddenly, then I found that I was able to do everything I wanted to do. And again, social anthropology, you asked, social anthropology is a very small department at Oxford. In fact, it's called the Institute of Social Anthropology. And I don't know if the situation has changed now, but back then you couldn't even do social anthropology as an undergraduate. The first degree that they offered was called a diploma in social anthropology. That's just a year-long course. But again, it was very important for me just to be able to travel and see the world. And, anthropology is a very good way of seeing the world because you don't, you, you become something other than a tourist. You actually have to go and live somewhere for a long time. It became possible for me to travel to many, many places. So, I actually studied Arabic in Tunisia. And at the end of that, I hitchhiked across the Sahara, which was an amazing experience. I went through through these deserts with the Grand. One of those deserts is called the Grand Oriental Erg Desert. With these towering dunes and so on. And all of this later fed into my writing in one way or another. So it was very exciting. And then after that, my scholarship was meant to be just for 2 years. Once I became interested in Arabic and the Arab world, my supervisor, who was a wonderful man called Dr. Peter Leonhardt, he was the resident specialist on the Middle East at the Institute of Social Anthropology at that time. And he urged me to do a PhD, a DPhil. And I told him, look, I just have 2 years funding. But he said, no, if you get funding for 3 years, then it doesn't matter. That covers your fees for a DPhil. He was absolutely wrong about this. It is covered to my cost later. But he actually persuaded the INLACS Foundation to cover an extra year for me. I was able to go off to Egypt, where I lived in a small village in northern Egypt. And that was really completely fundamental to my career as a writer, because it was while living in this village that I started keeping a journal and so on. And it was really my equivalent of writing school.
I began to dream of Cairo in the evenings. As I sat in my room, listening, while Abu Ali berated his wife or shouted at some unfortunate customer who had happened to incur his displeasure while making purchases at his shop. I would try to shut out the noise by concentrating on my book, or my diaries, or by turning up the volume of my transistor radio. But Abu Ali's voice always prevailed, despite the thick mud walls of his house and the squawking of the ducks and geese who lived around my room. This is the opening of In an Antique Land, a book based on Amitav Ghosh's time working on his PhD in Egypt. But what exactly is this story? A novel? A diary? Something in between? With its jumps between a medieval trader's life and Ghosh's own time, it is perhaps beyond genre definition. But how did Ghosh come up with this story in the first place? What inspired him to write it, and how would he define the work?
People often describe that book as a novel, and I always have to explain to them, no, it's not a novel. It's nonfiction. I mean, there's not a word of fiction in it. I didn't make up anything. But it was my third book, and by the time I began to write it, I had already written 2 novels. So I knew very well the difference between fiction and nonfiction.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened is that the way I came to be interested in Arabic and in the Middle East is that I knew that there was a long history of contacts between India and, of course, Egypt and other parts of the Middle East. But one day, I was at a library. I think it was it wasn't the Bodleian. I think it was the Ashmolean or somewhere like that. And I came across this volume of letters that had been letters written by medieval Jewish traders. And there was this trader called Abraham ben Yiju, who was actually born in Tunisia. But then he went to live in Cairo, in a part of Cairo called Fustat. And then from there, he went to India, and he lived in India for 17 years. This is in the 12th century. And he lived there for 17 years in a place called Mangalore. And then he came back to Egypt, but he brought an Indian servant with him. And there were some cryptic references to this servant. And this got me really interested in thinking about these long contacts between India and Egypt and the Middle East, contacts which have sort of lasted over 8 centuries. So that was what really got me launched upon this project of doing research in Egypt. And the sort of research I did was not really anything to do with medieval history or anything of that kind. It was a pretty standard village study, as they used to be called in those days. It was just an ethnography of 2 villages in a region called Behera in Egypt. But what it did do for me is that I became at that time extremely fluent in Arabic, in colloquial Arabic. So many years later, but it was fieldwork for anthropologists is always a very intense experience, because there you're completely alone. You're in a place where you don't know anyone, where in the beginning you don't even know the language, you don't have any friends. So it's almost, you could say, a sort of traumatizing experience, I'm sure you can imagine what it's like. A culture shock in multiple levels, So for me, there was the culture shock of arriving at Oxford, and then from there, the culture shock of arriving in Egypt. So after I finished my PhD, which I had to do in a record time, actually, because contrary to what my supervisor, Dr. Leonhardt, had said, it turned out that if I didn't finish my PhD within this 3-year time span, I wouldn't graduate with a degree. So in the end, I actually had to write my thesis in pretty much all of it in 5 weeks. So it was very, very intense in many ways. But then after that, I went back to India, and all I wanted to do was write a novel, really. And that's what I did. Over the next 3 years, I had a couple of, sort of jobs at think tanks and so on. But fortunately, these jobs, they didn't, they paid me very, very little. But I was able to to write my first novel. But after I had written my first novel and my second novel, both of which I wrote in New Delhi in the 1980s, and New Delhi in the 1980s was a very intense and kind of violent place. There were all these insurgencies. There was the insurgency, especially in the Punjab. And in 1984, while I was there was this assassination of Indira Gandhi, which was followed by a pogrom in which thousands of Sikhs died. And, I was an eyewitness to all of that. And this was a very intense time to live through. And then, I wrote these books over there. But somehow my mind kept returning to Egypt and to the time I had spent in this village. And I realized that unless I wrote about it as a book, I would never be able to, as it were, get past that experience.
Yeah.
So I wrote out a proposal, and I sent it to Bill Buford, who was then the editor of Granta magazine, Granta, he had revived Granta. He was one of the great editors, really, of all time, I would say. He'd taken a sort of interest in my career and had helped me publish at Granta and so on. So when I sent him this proposal, he immediately took to it and said, yeah, go ahead, I'll give you some money. So go ahead and write this book. Brilliant. So that's what made it possible for me to write the book.
Fantastic. I wanted to ask you, actually, you mentioned earlier talking about several levels of culture shock. And I was just wondering if that maybe influence, because I think a lot of the books you write are often about cross-cultural identity and people moving between different cultures. And I was just wondering if you think that your own experience of traveling first from India to Oxford and then Oxford to Egypt and then back to India, whether that sort of shaped your own desire to write about cross-cultural identity and experience.
Oh, yes, very much so. But, even though I've written about a lot of different places and have lived in a lot of different places, there's the one constant in my life has always been Bengal, which is where I'm from. I was born in Calcutta, and Bengal has been really a place that I've always returned to. And Bengali, which is my mother tongue, has played a very important part in my life as well, because it's provided me with a lot of resources. You're a student of history, so you know how important primary sources are.
Yes.
And Bengali is incredibly rich in primary sources of many different kinds, going back to the early Middle Ages and so on. And I've relied on them a lot. And especially, Bengal is also the home of the Sundarban. The Sundarban is the world's largest mangrove forest. And I've written about the Sundarban in many different books. In a lot of my work, I keep returning to the Sundarban. And that's been a very important part of my life and my career, which has been so all my sort of environmental and ecological engagements really began in the Sundarban, but also I could say they began in Egypt, because it was while I was living in this village that I really came to understand what it means to be a farmer, or you could say a peasant, living off the land, and what that involves, as a way of life, as a way of wresting a living from the soil, if you like. So yes, all of that has played a very important part in my life.
Something I've always wanted to ask of an author who writes accurate and detailed historical fiction is, where do you begin? Writing a novel is already difficult enough, but ensuring the history of the work is truthful, realistic, and accurate to the time period must be nightmarish. I wouldn't even know where to start. So how did Amitav Ghosh do it? And did his time at Oxford help him with that researching aspect?
That goes back very much to my DPhil and to the research that I did in the various libraries at Oxford back then. But more than that, I think it really goes back to In an Antique Land, because in order to write in an antique land, I suddenly found myself in a situation where I had to learn this medieval dialect called Judeo-Arabic, because Abraham ben Yeju's letters were written in Judeo-Arabic, and Judeo-Arabic is a very obscure language, not known by very many people. But I had to translate. I ended up having to translate Abraham ben Yeju's letters from Judeo-Arabic. And Oxford, actually, the Bodleian has one of the largest collections of Judeo-Arabic documents. It's called the Taylor-Schechter collection. And back in those days, it's amazing to think of now. You could actually sit in the Bodleian and you'd be handed these manuscripts, these 800-year-old manuscripts, and you'd hold them in your hand, and you would, you could read them as you sat there with them. So, I really had to sort of acquaint myself with many kinds of different techniques of research and languages and so on. And I think that really made me lose my fear of archives. That was where I really became very interested in archives, and I learned my way around archives, how to do research in archives and so on. So later, as I wrote my other books, I kept returning to archives of various kinds. And certainly for my 3 historical novels, this is the Ibis trilogy, which are actually about 19th century India and connections with China and about indentured labor and so on. I did a lot of research, uh, at the British Library. The British Library is an amazing resource, So I found a lot of material there. And, to be honest, I enjoy the research. I certainly enjoyed the research for the Ibis trilogy. I mean, research is the easy part. I mean, it's much easier than writing because there it is. It's all there in front of you.
Let's move on to Ghosh's more recent shift towards environmental works. He has written both fictional works, such as The Hungry Tide and Gun Island, and non-fictional works, such as The Great Derangement and The Nutmeg's Curse, which focus on environmental themes, exploring both the environment and how it affects people, places, economics, societies. Essentially, the intersection of the natural and human worlds. So I wanted to explore with him how he approaches environmental issues. Does he look at them with a social anthropological angle? Does he look at them with a social anthropological angle? Are there other influences on this change? How does he approach the major themes of his novels in general?
Yeah, I have many different perspectives in my head, and they're not separate. So I've done a lot of journalism in my life, and that's been a very important part of my career. Certainly, what I learned of social anthropology helped me with my journalism, and my journalism helped with social anthropology. These things feed into each other. And as an undergraduate, I studied history in Delhi University, so that has also helped me in many ways. I have a really sort of powerful engagement with history. So in my later books, especially with my book The Nutmeg's Curse and a lot of other books which approach the planetary crisis in various different ways, I've drawn upon what I know of history, what I know of anthropology, what I know of writing fiction. All those things come together, and people often ask me, what did you draw upon for this or that? I don't even know. In my head, it's all in.
Oxford is a bit of a world apart, and although the workload can be intense, the social life can be even more so. There are thousands of clubs and groups, societies, unions. They're all over the place. So was there anything that Amitav Ghosh particularly felt affected by, got involved in, or loved? Did he have any particularly memorable experiences which perhaps changed him or shaped him and his perspective on things?
I don't even know where to begin. It was just all of it. I mean, it was like waking up and finding yourself, in a fairyland or a dream or something. It was just I would literally wake up sometimes, unable to believe where I was. It was just so astonishing to me. Everything was new. Everything had that peculiar brightness and sharpness, that you bring to the world when you're a young adult, just discovering the world for yourself. So it was all just marvelous. And I met so many people. I made so many friends. I would say, strangely enough, Delhi University, where I had done my MA, was at that time academically a very exciting place. I had amazing teachers. And when I arrived at Oxford, I actually discovered that, I knew more than most of my fellow students, or, I was certainly abreast of everything. So I could spend my time really just discovering other things, friendships, parties, social life, So all of that was just fantastic. I really had a absolutely wonderful time. Even though, and I have to say this, back in those days, there was a lot of racism in England, I mean, it was sort of really in-your-face kind of racism. I mean, cars would stop and call you names as you're walking down the high street, And that racism existed even at the college level. I mean, you would encounter it all the time. But somehow it didn't really matter to me, I have to say. because I was just enjoying myself so much. I was discovering so many things and learning so much and making so many friends. And really, a lot of these friendships have remained lifelong friendships.
Coming from India to England is a major shift, as we've already touched on a little. The culture shock and environmental change must have been extraordinarily impactful. So I want Amitav to reflect with me a little more on these changes, and also what he thought of the people he met at Oxford and how they perhaps changed him.
When you're at a college as a graduate student, you don't really mix with the undergraduates, that really just doesn't happen at all. So, and I'm sure that was the case when I was there, and I'm sure that it's still the case now. So, college life is really a sort of marginal thing for graduate students, but you have your own common room. And that was a big part of my life, hanging out there. I remember that was when, those early Le Carre novels were being produced as series on television. Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy and so on. You probably never even heard of them, but
No, I've seen Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy.
With Alec Guinness and everything. And every week there'd be a new episode, and we'd all crowd into the common room to watch. So I remember that. I remember that very vividly. And the common room had its own, social functions and institutions, and a bar and so on. And it was great. I mean, the Teddy Hall common room for graduate students was fantastic, and I, made a lot of friends there. I had very warm memories of that, really. But what's also really nice over there is that you get invited to other people's common rooms, and you get to see the university, as it were, laterally. So, as a graduate student, I think the experience is very different from that of an undergraduate.
I am sure if I moved countries, came to a place alone to pursue studies at a foreign university, I would feel changed by the experience. But then again, I'm not exactly a budding social anthropologist. Did Amitav Ghosh feel changed by his time at Oxford, or merely the experience of living in a different country? Did he feel like it made an impression on him, or changed his way of looking at things? Or was the difference not so significant?
When one looks back on one's life, you realize that it's not so much that that the shifts in one's life are like turning a corner or a new turn or something. It's all an accumulation of experience,
Yeah.
And for me, Oxford was certainly a very, very rich source of experience. It gave me, an acquaintance, as I said, with libraries, with archives, with archival methods, with methods of research, and it also made me cosmopolitan. So I don't have much trouble fitting in, wherever I go. I mean, it becomes second nature in a way, after you've been around quite a lot. And those early experiences certainly played a very, very important part in my life. And absolutely. I mean, I think if I were to say, I look back and say, where did I get the richest deposits of experience in my life? Oxford would certainly be one of them.
Ghosh has had an amazing life experience. From India to Oxford, Egypt to New York, the vast geographical, cultural and societal experiences Ghosh has had has perhaps contributed to his deep, intimate human novels set against global backgrounds. It is clear Ghosh's life has revolved around meeting people and coming to understand new mindsets and attitudes, from Abu Ali to the graduate students he mixed with at Teddy Hall and his journalism days in Delhi. Ghosh's diverse life experience certainly contribute to his truthful and provoking literary production. Thank you so much for joining me today, Amitav, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed.